Barry said that his remarks were at the 45,000 feet. My remarks are going to be at 90,000 feet. and I think what I'm trying to do is to link the two sub-themes of the conference, the policy and the politics. And the issue here is whether or not this U.S. policy, known as engagement, has worked as a tool to improve the politics in China. So this is also the election year, and even though Trump doesn't use that term, engagement, I'm not sure he's aware of the concept. The fact that the idea of engagement has been invoked by a number of U.S. presidents to justify increasing trade, increasing investment with China. And there's debate, and the debate now is more on the side of the view that it has not worked. Right? So what I'm going to do now is try to make a case that we ought to give engagement benefit of the doubt and give it another try. And let me lay out why I argue the way that I argue. I'm going to do it in three ways. One is to talk about the level of the engagement, and then to talk about the direction of the engagement, and then conclude by talking about the political argument and the economic argument for engagement. It is very interesting if you follow the policy discussions and the political discussions on trade. And this is not just limited to China, but it is also true in other areas. Usually the rationale is a political rationale, and rather than an economic rationale. And the political rationale is something like the follows, right? So if we get a country X, in this case China, more engaged in the international system, in terms of trade, in terms of investment, the probability, there's more probability of the country X moving toward a democracy than isolating that country in terms of trade and in terms of investment, right? So that's how President Bill Clinton, that's how President George Bush argued for the most favored nation trading status, and that's how President Clinton argued for the WTO status for China. I think it's very important to be reminded of the fact that the original rationale for trade had nothing to do with politics, right? So if we go back to David Ricardo, it was all about comparative advantages and maximizing comparative advantages as a way to promote economic growth and economic development. Right? So if you go to an academic discussion on trade, usually the discussion is about whether or not trade does that, or under what conditions trade doesn't do that, and what are the distributional consequences of trade when you allow free trade to happen. Usually it is not argued, at least not the ones that I go to. Usually it is not argued that trade is going to give you democracy. It's going to give you rule of law. So I think it's important that we should think about whether the original expectation of the trade is a right one, right? And so the more systematic development of trade has to do with economics. It's not about politics. And I can understand why in a democracy you need to sell trade on the basis of politics, right? Because trade in this country is viewed as anti-labor, as anti-employment. So essentially you have to show kind of non-economic benefits of the trade as a politician in order to get the trade agreement passed by Congress and by the legislative body, right? But it is very important that for the analytical community to be aware of the fact that the more solid argument for trade is really based on economics rather than on politics. And I think there the evidence is fairly clear. Trade and investment have delivered economic benefits to China, and the debate, a lot of the presentations today were about how the US workers felt about globalization and trade, and maybe the positive trade effects are not as big as some people would argue, but it's hard to think of a scenario where trade has hurt the US economy in aggregate. It may hurt some sectors of the US economy, it may benefit other sectors of the economy. It's hard to make an argument that trade has hurt US economy in aggregate. I think in developing countries, the evidence is super, super clear. Trade and investments have benefited developing economies, have benefited India and China. And this is one reason why in the Gallup polls in emerging economies, trade in emerging economies is typically ranked as being more supported by the population than trade in developed economies. Right? That's point number one. And point number two is that there's a symmetry to how the trade is used as a political tool and how it is used as an economic tool. In China, trade and investment are never advocated on political grounds. You know, is China today a democracy? I definitely think it's not. If you were to ask me whether or not Chinese political system today is less arbitrary and more predictable than it was 25 years ago and 30 years ago, I would say by and large the answer is yes. Right? It's less arbitrary and less predictable. I cannot link that with trade and investment, but I think at least superficially these things tend to go together. The big exception is what has happened since 2013. Right? So you could make a legitimate argument that until 2013, you know, at least the country was trending, you know, maybe 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, toward more or less a liberal direction. The way I define liberal is not democracy, freedom of speech. The way I keep telling people I'm Chinese, so I have low standard. So when you have a negative system, right, to me, that's progress, right? So it's not you have free media. You actually, the progress is in the form of you know where the boundary is, right? So those are the topics I'm not supposed to talk about, and then the rest I can talk about, right? So I think China, at least until 2013, was moving more or less in that direction, right? So you knew what the negative list was, and you know not to touch the things that are on that list. I think what has happened since 2013 is, I think there are 2 things. One is the expansion of the negative list, right? So Jeremy just gave an example of that, right? Essentially expanding the definition of national security to economic security to cultural security. I have no idea what cultural security is. You know, I'm Chinese, I live in the US, I feel relatively culturally secure. So I don't feel huge loss of cultural security. So I have no idea. I mean, national security, even that is more or less a debatable proposition. So you see this expansion of the definition of those things on the negative list. And you may even see a shift from sort of a negative list approach to a positive list approach, right? So that I worry, right? So I do believe that this is a big change if you change from the negative list to a positive list. You don't even know what you're not supposed to say. That I worry about, right? So, so I think what has happened since then is evidence of the fact that engagement theory is more about probability companies who are members of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce operating in China, there's a fundamental difference between that and the Chinese companies operating in this environment. Okay, so think about the requirements and the conditions and the situations of a Chinese company operating in this environment. You have to deal with labor unions. You have to deal with these annoying journalists. You have to deal with ignorant members of the Congress. And you have to deal with all sorts of random things that you wouldn't need to deal with, right? You also deal with rule of law and what rule of law is all about. You have to deal with political shocks, right? So the operating environment in this country, I would argue, is far more complicated than the operating environment. I mean, Jeremy lists lots of things, and I'm not taking away the complexities of those things. But at least those are sort of, you kind of know what they are, and you work on reducing them or avoiding them. But in this environment, right, so anything can intrude upon your business, right? And so I think the Chinese entrepreneurs and Chinese companies gain a deeper exposure to globalization, to democracy, and to the rules of the economic and political game than they would by simply receiving foreign investments in China, right? So lastly, let me conclude that, and this is really summarizing what I just said, which is I think the economic benefits are in and of themselves both necessary and sufficient for supporting trade and investment. So this is the minimum argument for engagement. The maximum argument for engagement has to do with politics. And that should be considered as a bonus, right? That shouldn't be considered as a necessary condition. It is a bonus. If it happens, that's great. If it doesn't happen, well, then it doesn't happen. So if we have that perspective, then we should really allow trade and investments to play out. I mean, in the future, they may affect politics, they may not affect politics. As long as they produce economic growth, as long as they produce broad improvement of the welfare of the Chinese and American people, then we, as members of the analytical community, should be in full support of trade and investment. Thank you very much.